February 1944. Across the vast Pacific, a silent war unfolded beneath the waves. While the world's attention remained fixed on island battles and aircraft carriers, another campaign, cold, relentless, and invisible, was already deciding Japan's fate. The submarines of the United States Navy had become ghosts of the deep. They hunted without mercy, unseen and unheard, striking when least expected. And their mission was not glory or conquest, but strangulation. By early 1944, Japan's once proud merchant fleet was vanishing faster than it could be replaced. Convoys that once carried rice, oil, and steel now carried death. Submarines stalked them day and night, cutting the arteries that fed the Japanese war machine. Every ship sunk meant fewer tanks, fewer planes, fewer bullets, and fewer chances for Japan to survive. One survivor recalled the horror. "I was on deck when the torpedo struck. It saved my life. I jumped into the water and swam away. The ship sank in 2 minutes. The suction pulled men underwater. I heard them screaming. Then, silence. I floated in the water for 18 hours before rescue. Every time I close my eyes, I still hear the ship sinking. Of the 4,500 men aboard, fewer than 700 survived. By the start of 1945, American submarines faced an unexpected problem. They couldn't find enough targets. The Japanese merchant fleet, once sprawling across the Pacific, was now a graveyard beneath it. Some submarines returned home without firing a single torpedo. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Fluckey of USS Barb resorted to attacking coastal trains and factories with his deck gun because there were no ships left to sink. Commander Lawson Ramage of USS Parch even requested reassignment, calling submarine warfare obsolete due to lack of targets. But obsolete it was not. It was victory, complete and devastating. Japan's war economy didn't collapse because its factories were destroyed. It collapsed because nothing could reach them. The oil tankers from the Dutch East Indies, the lifeline of Japan's navy, never made it home. Rubber, tin, and steel sat uselessly in Southeast Asian ports. Food shipments from Korea and Manchuria rotted while Japanese civilians starved. By March 1945, Japan's fuel reserves were gone. The combined fleet, the pride of the emperor, was trapped in harbor, not by bombs or blockades, but by empty fuel tanks. Battleships became floating fortresses, unable to leave port. Aircraft were grounded, training flights canceled. Even patrol boats sat silent. In April, the submarine USS Tirante under Lieutenant Commander George Street scored one of the last victories of the war, sinking 4 ships in the Gulf of Tonkin. But there was no fleet left to fight. The silent war beneath the sea had already been won. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, its merchant marine was a corpse. Of the 6.4 million tons of shipping it possessed in 1941, plus 3.9 million tons built during the war, only 1.5 million tons remained, and most of that barely floated. 8.8 million tons had been sunk, annihilated. It was the most complete destruction of a merchant fleet in history. But victory came at a cost. 52 American submarines never returned. 3,506 submariners perished, a 22% casualty rate, the highest of any U.S. armed service in the war. Yet for every submarine lost, Japan lost nearly 170,000 tons of shipping and thousands of men. Never before or since has such a small force delivered such catastrophic results. Only 288 submarines, less than 2% of the U.S. Navy's total, had strangled an empire. Their success rested on 6 pillars: technology, intelligence, tactics, doctrine, industry, and human will. Technologically, U.S. submarines were unmatched. They carried radar and sonar systems Japan could barely comprehend. The Mark 18 electric torpedo left no wake, striking without warning. Even mines could be detected by late-war sonar. Intelligence was their secret weapon. Thanks to Operation Magic and Ultra, American cryptanalysts intercepted and decoded Japanese naval communications. Submarines knew convoy routes days in advance, waiting silently along their paths. Japanese captains sailed to their deaths on schedules already read in Washington. Tactically, the Americans perfected the wolf pack, multiple submarines coordinating attacks on a single convoy. It was a page borrowed from the Germans, but executed with far greater precision and communication. Japanese escorts were overwhelmed. Doctrinally, U.S. leadership made one fateful decision after Pearl Harbor: unrestricted submarine warfare, no warnings, no rules. Every Japanese ship became a legitimate target, and with that, Japan's sea lanes began to bleed. Industrial might ensured it continued. While Japan could barely replace its losses, American shipyards built new submarines faster than the enemy could sink them. The Pacific turned into a one-sided slaughter, and at the heart of it all were the men, the submariners, volunteers who lived weeks at a time in claustrophobic darkness, enduring crushing depth charges, the stench of diesel, and the fear of never surfacing again. They were the ghosts of the deep, calm, methodical, deadly. By 1945, the psychological scars of this unseen war extended far beyond the statistics. Japanese captains and sailors lived in constant dread. Convoy duty became a death sentence. In 1987, at a reunion of surviving Japanese merchant sailors, Captain Tishi Yamada, who survived 3 submarine attacks, described his torment. "I am 82 years old. The war ended 42 years ago. But every night, I dream of the submarines. I see the periscope rise from the water. I hear torpedoes launch. I try to turn the ship, but I move in slow motion. The torpedoes hit. The ship shudders. Men scream. Then I wake up, every night, the same dream. The Americans were ghosts. We never saw them, but they were everywhere." Another survivor, engineer Kenji Matsumoto, remembered his final moments aboard Asamaru. "The torpedo threw me across the engine room. Lights failed. I crawled in darkness, feeling my way up. Men were climbing over each other. The ship was tilting. I jumped into the water. Oil burned my eyes. I swam for hours. When rescue came, only 184 of 600 survived." Stories like these repeated thousands of times. And behind each sinking lay not just physical destruction, but a strategic collapse. Convoy inefficiency became its own weapon. Ships idled for days waiting to form protected groups. Zigzag routes extended voyages by weeks. Slower speeds cut the number of annual trips in half. Even ships that survived were, effectively, crippled. Every escort ship Japan built was one fewer destroyer guarding its fleet. Every aircraft sent on anti-submarine patrol was one less defending Tokyo from bombers. Every radar turned seaward was one that couldn't warn of B-29s. The submarines didn't just sink ships, they dismantled Japan's entire strategy. Reinforcements to the Philippines never arrived. Food and fuel never reached the home islands. Entire garrisons across the Pacific Starved in isolation, cut off by submarines they never even saw, MacArthur's island-hopping campaign succeeded partly because the Japanese troops he bypassed were already dead men, left to rot on islands surrounded by invisible hunters. Even the strategic bombing of Japan's cities owed its success to the submarines. Fighter planes couldn't intercept the bombers because their tanks were dry. The oil tankers that might have refueled them lay at the bottom of the sea. No campaign in military history so perfectly demonstrated the principle of economic warfare. German U-boats in the Atlantic failed to strangle Britain. British submarines could not cut Germany's land supply lines. Japanese submarines, obsessed with warships, ignored commerce entirely. Only the U.S. submarines in the Pacific achieved total annihilation of an enemy's economy through maritime warfare alone. The lessons changed naval doctrine forever. The United States made submarines the core of its post-war fleet, silent, nuclear, and global. The Soviet Union built the largest submarine force in history, seeking to replicate the same invisible dominance. For Japan, the trauma became national memory. Its new maritime self-defense force focused obsessively on anti-submarine warfare, determined never to be that vulnerable again. Japanese engineers became world leaders in sonar and detection systems, born from the ghosts that haunted their fathers. In 1995, a memorial was raised in Tokyo to honor Japan's merchant sailors. The granite wall lists 60,000 names, men who died not in glory, but in terror at sea. The inscription reads, "They sailed into danger, knowing death awaited them. They served their nation faithfully until the sea claimed them. Their sacrifice must never be forgotten." Each name tells a story. The Tamatsumaru, sunk with 4,755 men. The Teiamaru, 2,665 lost. The Myozenmaru, 3,437 souls gone. The Tatsutamaru, 1,481 more. And for every name carved in stone, 3 more vanished without record, swallowed by the Pacific forever. In total, 1,314 Japanese merchant ships sunk. Over 5.3 million tons of shipping destroyed. Nearly 100,000 soldiers lost at sea. Tens of thousands of civilians, laborers, and prisoners drowned in transport ships turned coffins. Japan's empire starved, not by bombs, not by battles, but by silence. And the men who waged this silent war paid the highest price. 52 submarines lost. 3,506 men entombed in steel graves beneath the waves. No newsreels, no parades. Their mission remained classified long after the war ended, but their victory was absolute. They proved that with intelligence, technology, and resolve, a handful of men could break an empire. That an unseen enemy could strike harder than any bomb. That a whisper beneath the sea could drown an entire nation. For the Japanese who faced them, it was terror beyond comprehension. They never saw their killers. Only the trails of bubbles, the shudder of impact, and the screams of dying men. To them, the Americans were phantoms, relentless, invisible, unstoppable. The Japanese called them the Silent Death, and long after the war ended, that name remained. Because the submarines didn't just end Japan's war, they ended its belief in invincibility. They ended its empire, and beneath the endless quiet Pacific, they still sleep. The hunters and the hunted, side by side. A battle had raged for days. The black volcanic sand of Iwo Jima was now soaked with sweat, blood, and ash. The iconic flag atop Mount Suribachi had given the world a moment of hope, but on the island itself, the war was far from over. The Marines who looked up at that flag still had 6 more square miles of hell to fight through. Every ridge, every crater, Every cave concealed Japanese defenders who would rather die than surrender. Beneath the island, General Kurabayashi's labyrinth of tunnels and bunkers stretched for miles. He had designed Iwo Jima not to be defended, but to bleed the Americans dry. Every time a squad advanced, another ambush awaited. Every time a tank rolled forward, hidden artillery erupted from the ground. Flamethrowers, grenades, satchel charges, brutal tools used in close combat where neither side could retreat. It wasn't a battle of sweeping maneuvers or grand strategies anymore. It was men crawling through smoke, bayonets fixed, hearts pounding. The Japanese fought with the ferocity of men who knew they would never leave the island alive. And for the Americans, every yard gained came at a price counted in lives. By early March, nearly half of the island was secured, but the cost was staggering. Thousands of Marines had fallen, and yet the fighting intensified. The 4th and 5th Marine Divisions were running low on everything but determination. Supplies came by landing craft, under constant shell fire. Medics dragged the wounded across open ground, using only their bodies as shields. Each night, Kurabayashi's men launched counterattacks under the cover of darkness. They moved through tunnels, emerging behind American lines like ghosts. Then, as dawn broke, they vanished underground again. On March 11th, U.S. commanders believed resistance might finally be collapsing, but Kurabayashi still commanded from the depths. His last messages, intercepted later, revealed no despair, only grim pride. He knew Japan had already lost the air and sea, but he wanted to show that Japanese soldiers could make even the mightiest enemy bleed. By March 16th, Iwo Jima was declared secured. But the word secured meant something different here. Pockets of resistance still fought on for days. Some Japanese soldiers continued to emerge from tunnels weeks later, launching suicidal attacks. The last known defender of Iwo Jima wouldn't surrender until 1951, 6 years after the war ended. The official numbers told one story: 6,821 Americans killed, 19,000 wounded, nearly 21,000 Japanese dead, with only 216 taken prisoner. But beyond the numbers was something deeper, a shift in the war's moral gravity. For the first time, American strategists could see Japan itself on the horizon. Iwo Jima's airfields became vital for emergency landings of B-29 bombers. Thousands of American airmen owed their lives to that tiny, charred island. But the victory also carried a haunting lesson. If Japan's soldiers fought like this for 8 square miles of rock, how would they fight for their homeland? The answer, in the minds of U.S. commanders, led down a dark path to Okinawa and eventually to Hiroshima. In Tokyo, the news of Iwo Jima's loss hit like a thunderclap. The Imperial General Staff had promised the emperor that the island would never fall. Now, for the first time, Japanese civilians began to sense the unthinkable, that the war might be unwinnable. Kurabayashi was mourned as a national hero. His strategy had turned Iwo Jima into a graveyard, but also a legend. In his final letter, written before the battle began, he told his son, "I will fight to the end for my country. Do not expect my return." Back in the United States, a photograph of the flag raising spread like wildfire. It was printed on newspapers, banners, and postage stamps. It symbolized courage, sacrifice, and unity, though many didn't realize that 3 of the 6 men in the photo would never return home. The U.S. government used the image to rally war bond sales, calling on the public to finish what those men had started. And in small towns across America, mothers and fathers clutched the telegrams that told them their sons had died on a place they'd never heard of. a name that would now be burned into history. Iwo Jima. Even as the battle faded into history books, its echoes lingered. The Marines who survived carried its memories, the sulfur smell, the sound of mortars, the faces of friends lost in the smoke. And for many, those memories never left them. Some said the island itself was cursed, others called it sacred. To those who fought there, it was both, a place where hell met heroism. Iwo Jima wasn't just a victory. It was a mirror held up to humanity, showing both the courage and the cost of war. The courage of men who ran into fire to pull their brothers out. The cost measured not in medals, but in silence, in the faces that never came home. The war in the Pacific didn't end on Iwo Jima. It only grew darker, fiercer, more desperate, and soon the world would witness the most devastating choice ever made in human history. If this story moved you, if it made you feel the weight of sacrifice, the fire of courage, and the silence of loss, then stay with us. Because in our next World War II documentary, we'll journey to Okinawa, where the sea turned red and the fate of Japan itself was sealed. Subscribe now and keep the fire of history alive, because every story we uncover reminds us of who we are and what we must never forget.